Hello everyone and welcome to another special episode of Making the Box. This time I'm going to show you a bit of the logic process of making Guardians the Kree's Last Stand, the last toy box I showed you on video. So here we are on the toy box logic. As you can see here, I use again the Death Star terrain, one of my favorites from 3.0. A few animation decorations here for a sci-fi experience, and this texture right here I'm gonna explain it to you later because that's the very last part of the toy box. So this toy box has first of all has a trigger area right here, which is going to start a challenge maker, and it also has a toy box game maker. So what does the toy box game maker do? Toy box game maker is placed so that the toy box is locked to only using Guardians of the Galaxy characters, and then the trigger area just starts the challenge maker. Right here. There's no logic in terms of something happening when the challenge maker starts. All of the logic involved with the challenge maker is when the game ends. So I'll talk about more about the challenge maker later. Oh, and those wondering, this Skydome is the Toy Story Skydome, which is available in-game. You don't need a disc for it. Anyway, this ship, the Milano, is set up so that as soon as the player steps on the ship, this path will activate, and this path is the path connected to the Milano. So as soon as you get in the ship, you start taking a ride through the Milano. At the same time, when you enter the ship, it will activate the side-scroller 2D camera. It's gonna be a 2D cutscene. As soon as you cross this trigger area, this path creator will activate. This path creator is connected to this ship. There's two of them. These are merely decorations because these ships will fly. As soon as you pass through the trigger area, a ship will spawn here, one of the ships I show you, and will fly through here. This is to again make the toy box feel more alive and give it a little bit more details because we're in space. And it's also connected to a text creator, which is going to be the fun dialogue of the Guardians talking with each other on the ship. And this trigger area right here will activate another of the ships. Again, is this one, which is pathed to this path creator right here. Again, to add a little background atmosphere showing that when you arrive at the station, there's someone leaving the station at the same time. As soon as you arrive at this trigger area, the 2D camera will deactivate and you can see the back of the Milano landing. Very cool. So now here's where things are gonna get a bit more complicated. After your character lands right here, this will activate the path creator and checkpoint. This path creator is gonna be our 2D path. Why? Because this toy box, at least this part of the toy box, is gonna be 2D side scroller, only movement left to right. So here's the logic. Enter by the trigger area will activate 2D character movement. For how many players? That depends on you. And that's it. Literally, the player will be stuck in 2D once you activate that simple little thing called activate 2D character movement. It's very easy, very simple, but it can be very tricky to manipulate in the end. One thing that you must note is that the player will only be able to walk up until the path is made. What do I mean by this? If your character's right here, the character wants to reach this area, they cannot because the path ends right here. So they can only get through here. There's going to be an invisible wall where the player will not be able to move because it's locked. You, with the path, decide how long will the character be able to walk. So in that way, if you don't want the player to go too far off the stage, you can lock them in with the path. There's also other simple settings, like, let me show you right here, like 2D character movement on the properties of the path. In here, you can adjust the width. What the width is, so if you want to provide space for the player. What do I mean by space? With space, it means that the player will be forced in 2D, but they're gonna have a little tiny space for them to be able to go up and down a little bit. If you want to create sort of a 2.5D character movement, you can do that with this. But that's not what we did in this case, but just wanted to show you a little bit of that if you want to try that out in the future. But before we start walking around, we're gonna have a camera that's going to activate, which is a cutscene way over here. Okay, this cutscene, although it looks simple, was quite complicated to do, because at first this is a cutscene, but later you as a player will walk here and activate another cutscene. Once the player activates checkpoint, it will activate that camera. But you might say, how can that checkpoint be set when the character is landing way over there? Well, it's simple. The checkpoint is set when you reach this trigger area. Aside from activating the path, you will set the checkpoint with this trigger area. So when checkpoint is set, it will activate this camera, and this camera is connected to this actor, which would be your new actor connection and all that stuff that if you saw in my previous video, well, I talk more about the cutscenes better there. But this is just a review. Make sure when using the actor, you put camera target connected actor, or if you're using a locator, put connected locator. And in this case, I use follow instead of stationary. Why? Because this particular character is on a path. So once camera activates, the path will go do reset and play. So when camera activates, path does reset and play. And she will play around walking all the way here. And since I set up this camera to follow, it's going to follow all her movement all the way to here. So once she reaches this particular point, is when the text activates. Once the very last text is said by her, this camera will deactivate. And then you're gonna appear here, because you'll be, by the time the camera activates, the player will be teleported here, off screen. What do I mean off screen? That means that there's stuff happening to the player, but they're not seeing it because they're watching a cutscene. So while the cutscene is playing, you're transporting the player to where you want them to be. Once the player is teleported in here, when they exit this trigger area, it will activate a 2D camera, which is this one. Do not deactivate a camera and quickly activate another one. Do not connect cameras with cameras together at all. It can be crazy and not really work at all. Or it may work once, but once you test it more times, it will break all of a sudden. So don't do it. Once you start off here, when that camera cutscene deactivates, you're gonna be in 3D for a few seconds, but when the player moves forward, it will activate the 2D camera, but we already activated the 2D character movement, so you shouldn't worry that the player will not get out of the trigger area or do something wrong because they're already locked in 2D. So anyway, the player now just walks around here and they'll meet the villain in this case. Again, for pieces, this is Tomorrowland pieces. This is actually Agrabah pieces. Agrabah playing balcony. I wanted to use something different. Right now, when the player also reaches this area, this is not the skydome that they get. It's the Kelm Prison skydome. This is Desktop pieces. This is Droid Factory pieces. Definitely great if you're doing the Droid Factory challenge. This is Kiln pieces. I try to keep it all sci-fi combinations of all the universe of sci-fi we have on the game. Anyway, once the player reaches this area, this trigger area will activate a dialogue, and when a certain text is removed, when specific line is missed, the logic call, it will activate this camera. What does this camera do? This camera will change this actor's behavior. You might say, what? That's new? You didn't say that before. Yeah, this is because this actor can have different emotions. So in this case, when camera is activated, I want this actor to play looped a certain emotion. Steve, craft, mire, flee, faint, jump off, disapprove, and whatever you want. In this case I use laughing because he has set a trap for you. Once that dialogue is done, this floor will disappear. This floor disappears with the use of the replayer. I already showed you last time how to use a replayer. A little replayer review. You step on the replayer, press record, you grab the piece that you want to disappear, stop the recording, and that's it. You have your replayer done. Now you just simply connect the logic. So when this camera activates, it will do a clear. A clear is to disappear the piece. But if you want the piece to come back, you just press reverse playback instead of clear. Anyway, the player is gonna fall here. When the player falls here, it's going to activate another camera. Here we have our other camera. This camera is on a path. Since the player is falling, we're gonna see this camera falling. So it's connected to a path. So when player touches this trigger area, the camera will activate, and when the camera activates, it's gonna do a reset and play on the path. Simple enough. After that, it's going to activate a certain text. It's gonna be the Guardians talking and all of that. And you have all your characters here. And in this particular case, I also did emotions because Groot jumps when a specific line is dismissed. In this case, he plays an emotion which is jumping up. So yeah, if you want a character to react in a certain way when a certain text is triggered, simply choose specific line dismiss, which means that when a line is dismissed and the next one comes, which is the one that will cause the emotion, it will play that action. So after that cutscene is done and the last text is done, it will take us to our platforming place, which is way over there. But before that, when the player falls right here, there's a trigger area right here. Once this camera activates, it will teleport the player right here. Why? Because I want to make sure the player has a transition so that the player is moved without the player knowing he got moved, because otherwise he would get stuck here, or he could trigger a trigger area again, start jumping up and down and activate the trigger area again, and that would activate the camera again and make things go crazy. When that camera finishes all its stacks and deactivates and all of that, the player will be teleported here. But to make that transition and not show you the player being teleported, we have another cutscene playing. This was a nice little cutscene I want to add so that the player can see the level that they're about to take on, which is quite a big little factory I made here. Again, camera on a path, but for this particular camera I did not use orient along path, but I do have here an actor, which is in this case Star-Lord, hidden because it's going to be my locator, because again, locator cameras can make path cameras shaky. So by connecting an actor there, I make sure my movement is pretty nice. Now, very important thing, making sure you have your 2D character movement for this next section if you are doing a completely 2D toy box. First of all, during that cutscene of your character falling down, you have to make sure you deactivated the last 2D character movement path, so that way the player doesn't get stuck and you can move him around throughout the toy box onto the next section. This is the case if you have different sections that are not completely together, which is my case here. So I wanted this area to be 2D as well, so when the player is teleported here and he exits the trigger area, it will activate a 2D character movement, and It will also activate the 2D camera. It's always nice if you add some visible barriers too, if you want to make sure the player doesn't get out of the place that you want them to be, just in case. It kind of works, but don't put it inside the invisible barrier unless you have enemies, which is another story I'll cover in another toy box I did. But in this case, it's a 2D platforming toy box without enemies. So again, always making sure you put your 2D character movement and your side-scroller camera. Here we have the star pieces, combinations, and all that stuff. I'm gonna talk to you about platforming, how to make some creative platforming that can, while also using simple pieces that already come handmade with the game. This piece right here is called a moving wall. This is part of the platforming toys. So basically you can use it and it already has movement. You don't have to do any logic on it. So that's pretty cool. This right here is from the Droid Factory pieces, and you can use it. It's already a movement. You don't have to use any logic on it. You can also use the Asgardian ones, conveyor belt, or conveyor belt this one. Depends on the style you're going for. I prefer the Droid Factory one because I don't know, it's a bit more dramatic and more factory-like, which was what I was going for most. Other platforming simple pieces are these ones, which can work as elevators. Well, that's the name of the piece. But yeah, an elevator platform, and the great thing about the platforming pieces like this one is that you can put any texture style you want. So you can put it snatch, you can put a soldier-like, a star, army, just whichever style you really want to. And of course, the Droid Factory has some nice little obstacles too, like the Crusher, the Chopper, and all this stuff. We even got some lasers and other stuff. There's a lot of platforming tools that already come with a lot of movement and a lot of action that can really help on your toy box without you needing to do too many sacrifices or learning too much. However, there's a little creative thing I did here with this particular things. This piece is a desert terrain piece. This is a triangle block. These are all pieces. There's nothing magical about these pieces. These are decorations. Droid Factory's melting pot platform does nothing. It just stands there floating. So, how do we make it be interesting? How do we make it feel alive? Well, we do it with effects. So here's our thing. In this area, we have these pillars shooting like a spark, as in a factory that is working. So, how do we do this? Firstly, we want the visual of the sparking. So we use an effects generator, which again is super simple. You just connect a locator of where you want the effect, and that's pretty much it. And in this case, I set this trigger area so it turns on the effect. Now, how do we make that effect cause damage on the player? That's when the fun begins, and this is where we play with the dynamic trigger. Okay, let's talk about the properties of the dynamic trigger first of all. The dynamic trigger, you're gonna set it up to whatever thing you want to cause damage, or something to cause you a reaction. It doesn't need to be causing damage. It can be to trigger a reaction on the character. Like on the Tron one, we'd set it up so that when you talk with someone, it would show a button to talk with them. So that was just with dynamic trigger. In this case, we want to cause damage. So since our effect is connected to a locator, we are gonna connect the dynamic trigger to that same locator. And once you connect it, make sure you set on the properties that I'm showing you right now that the target is set to locator, because it usually starts with the target saying this toy, but you don't really want this toy specifically. You want the locator or where the effect or the actor is. Now, trigger distance. Trigger distance is how much close you want it to affect the player. This is going to be something that you will need to analyze and test a lot, because this will vary depending on the effect. For this sparkling thing, I set it up to 5. because the sparkle thing is pretty big, and I wanted to make sure it covers at least the space of the pillar. That's more or less 5. But if you're using a little tiny fireball, for example, which is another of the effects, then you're going to need something much more smaller, which I would recommend between 3 or 2. Again, this is going to depend heavily upon testing. It will all depends on you testing it and making sure that it's causing the reaction that you want it to be. But anyway, how do we make sure it affects the player? Simple. You're gonna go new logic connection. When the player enters that dynamic trigger, any player, it's going to activate the kill switch. So we're gonna go, since I already set it up, let me show you. By enter by any, defeat, and you defeat the player. You can also set it up so that it defeats enemies if you have enemies and other stuff. In this case, I just simply put plain defeat because I just want the player to die, because I'm that evil. But there's other things that are a bit more complicated here. So you want this to be a factory, but we don't want the effect to be always on, because we want at some point the player be able to pass and not wait forever for the machine to deactivate. So how do we do that? How do we give it rhythm? How do we give it time? Well, that's when the time layer comes. First of all, make sure to figure out how much time you want the machine to last. The great thing about the time layer is that it's like a timer, but you don't get the visual of a timer, but you can do less seconds. A timer you can only do up to 10 seconds. Here you can do 1 second, 0.5 seconds, and very wide the limit of seconds you can use to trigger something. Okay, first of all, you're gonna have the first time layer be activated using the trigger area here at the beginning. Since I have different pillars around the toy box, I have it set up with different trigger areas, so when the player reaches this trigger area, it will activate the time layers down here. So that way you don't have too many stuff triggering at the same time. Otherwise the toy box might crash if you try to force it too many logics at the same time. I wouldn't recommend it. So in this case I have divided so that this first trigger area activates these 2 timely layers. So when that trigger area is crossed, it will activate this time layer, it will activate the effect, and it will activate the dynamic trigger. So when the seconds of this time layer are over, you will set it up so that it deactivates the effect and that it deactivates the dynamic trigger. You can see it here. Delay completed, off, dynamic trigger. Delay completed, stop looping effect, and time layer, delay completed, start delay on this time layer. So now you have already a lot of things connected. So when the 3 seconds or 4 seconds of this time layer happen, the effects will go off, this will go off, and this will be activated, but it will not do anything when it activates. Instead, when it ends the seconds that it runs, in this case it runs 4 seconds, it's going to activate everything again. So when the delay completed on this one is done, it will put on the dynamic trigger and it will start looping effects again. So the machine is back up again. And you put it so that when the delay is completed, it starts this delay. Always make sure the two complement each other if you want it to be something that turns on and off constantly in a rhythm. Basically, in summary, one turns off everything, the dynamic trigger of killing the player, and the effects once it's completed the seconds, and the other, once it's completed its seconds, activates the effects and the dynamic trigger of killing the player on. And always when each of them complete their seconds, they will activate each other. This is something that has to be there. Once it's done, you'll get your rhythm. And that's pretty much it's done throughout this toy box area here. Same setup again. The trigger areas will activate everything. And always make sure you put checkpoints on different sections of platforming toy box. I mean, you can make your platforming hard, but at least be friendly on your checkpoints. Anyway, once a player reaches this area, they will end the segment. So when they touch this trigger area, again what I mentioned previously, deactivate this path creator. So that way the player is now free again and is free to be transported to another area. And that area is gonna be way down here. But before that, when you reach that trigger area, it will activate the cutscene, which is a simple cutscene. It's just Rocket Raccoon telling you instructions of what you need to do next with some text. And when the camera activates, it will teleport the player to the next area off screen while you're reading the cutscene.